Alright, we only have until the end of the run, so let's get a rambling. Today, we are going to ramble about Star Wars, specifically Star Wars Acolyte, but we're leading into a bigger discussion, I promise. For those that are going to inevitably nitpick the heck out of this argument in the comments below, I want to say this takes place, what I'm talking about is specifically before the airing of episode 4 of Acolyte. Therefore, we are only going to consider things from episode 3 and before. But I should have plenty, and I honestly don't think episode 4 is going to change much of my stance on this. But here we go. When we're talking about Star Wars Acolyte, there have been a couple criticisms that I've seen a lot of over the past week or so. Number 1 is that it breaks the canon of Star Wars, and number 2 is that it belittles the importance of Anakin being the chosen one. So let's examine both of these things. First is that it breaks the canon of Star Wars. Now, I've seen a couple arguments, specifically in arguments that I've had with people online, about why this is the case. The first and most common thing I've seen is that we have never seen another person using the Force create life that early in the series, right? And I gotta say, that's a very dumb excuse to use when talking about how it breaks canon. Specifically because if we are going to say that a movie breaks canon simply because it shows something that we have never seen before, then every single movie and show in the Star Wars universe has broken canon, and therefore, by your own definition of breaking the canon, you should not like any of the Star Wars projects, right? A New Hope breaks canon because we had never seen anything about Star Wars prior to that, but it's the first movie that was released, so I'll give that one a pass. Empire Strikes Back breaks canon because we never knew about Yoda or Force visions. Return of the Jedi breaks canon because green lightsabers, Ewoks, and Force lightning. The Phantom Menace breaks canon because of Force speed. Attack of the Clones breaks canon because of cloning in general. Revenge of the Sith breaks canon because of Grievous wielding lightsabers when he's not a Jedi. Also, there's fire in space, which is a criticism I have seen of Acolyte as well. I could go on, but because most of the hate seems to be centered towards Disney Star Wars, that's just pre-Disney buyout of Star Wars that I'm talking about there. So this argument that we haven't seen it, therefore it can't exist and it breaks canon if it happens, you can't use that argument because, as you can see, any of the projects prior to this will fall into that same trap. So let's move on from that, right? So next, I just want to point out that it is, if anything, hinted in the canon that the creation of life is something that has existed in this universe for a long time, right? Even if we're not talking about manipulating the Force, cloning exists, and it has existed for a while. There's an entire movie in the prequel trilogy about how the Kaminoans had been building a clone army for years with nobody knowing. Each of these clones has been shown to have a distinct personality, which means they are not the same person. So is that not creating life? You have all of these clones that were created, and each of them is their own individual. So even without the Force, just through the use of science, the creation of life is a thing in the Star Wars universe. But if we want to specifically nitpick that it's only through the Force that you're talking about, then I hate to break it to you, but it is implied that this has in fact happened within the universe. Palpatine, when he's trying to win Anakin over, in his monologue that gets memed to death, so I know that all of y'all know this by heart, right? He states that Plagueis was so strong in the Force and so wise that he could manipulate the midichlorians to create life. Now, a lot of people might be trying to jump the gun and say, well, Palpatine was lying to entice Anakin over to his side, right? Well, if that's the case, why would he mention this to Anakin? Anakin has zero interest in creating life. He wants to prolong Padme's life. He wants to prevent death, not create life. So Palpatine mentioning this doesn't do anything to help win Anakin over. The only reason he would say something like that is because it's something that happened that he could use as a way to prove that Plagueis was so strong in the Force that he could do something like that, right? And we know that Palpatine was lying about being able to save Padme, right? We know that that's the case because he later on admits to Anakin that it's not a power that he knows how to do, right? They have to learn it together. That's the pitch to Anakin once he falls to the dark side. But that doesn't disprove that Plagueis could create life. All it does is show that Palpatine did not know how to do that. So if we're assuming that it has to be true, otherwise, why would Palpatine say it? Because lying serves no purpose. Lying about that served no purpose, right? So it has to be true that Plagueis had that ability. And if that's the case, where would Palpatine get that knowledge from? That knowledge that Plagueis could actually create life. Where would he know that? How would he know that? The only way he would know that Plagueis could in fact manipulate midichlorians to create life is if it happened before, and therefore he knew that it was possible to do this. So if anything, the very canon that everybody defends implies that what happened in episode 3 of the Acolyte, that reveal that these kids were created, it implies that that did happen. And that's in the prequels. This is before Disney Star Wars. This is a George Lucas movie here that I'm talking about. So your very own canon, if anything, implies that the events in Acolyte were always canon. That this is always something that was possible to have happened in the past. It does not break canon. I reject that argument. Let's move on to the second one. So the second thing I've heard is that it belittles the importance of Anakin being the chosen one. And when we're talking about that, there are a few things that I think we really need to get into, okay? The first is Anakin being the chosen one. Now, it's no shock here that Star Wars is never beating the Dune allegations, right? It is just a different telling of Dune. And in Dune, you have the same idea of this prophecy of a chosen one, right? The Lisan al-Gaib, right? And the thing is, you learn that that prophecy was fed to the Fremen by the bad guys. It was fed to them so that they would believe that there was a chosen one that would come and do all this stuff for them. And then there was a breeding, like they manipulated the breeding to try and create this fake chosen one, right? And Star Wars, it's not hidden very well, takes a lot of its inspiration from Dune. So this idea of the prophecy and this chosen one, you can see where I'm going with this, right? Because the Sith would take the place in that trying to manipulate and create the chosen one. If that's the case, then it would make sense that Plagueis had tried this already, which I believe, even though the story's not done, I can't say for all certainty about Acolyte that that's what's happening. I believe that that's the revelation we are going to get, is that this is Plagueis who is manipulating this in an attempt to create the chosen one, right? Obviously, it fails because we see that it did not disrupt the Jedi Order come the prequels. And therefore, Palpatine tries again and creates Anakin, who this time is found and ends up stepping into that chosen one spot, right? It doesn't water it down. It's just an expansion of this manipulation that the Sith had been doing for years and years and years, right? This is a prophecy that was fed to the Jedi in the same way that the clone army was fed to the Jedi, not by a Jedi, mind you. Palpatine had his hands in this clone army from day one. This is something that the Sith had planted for the downfall of the Jedi. How is this watering down any of the Star Wars mythos or breaking any of the canon? It all fits together. It all makes sense, right? Then, when you look at the prophecy specifically, more evidence to show that the prophecy is not real is that Yoda even hints in the Phantom Menace that the prophecy could be misread. He flat out says that in the source material that everybody holds in the highest regard, that the prophecy might not be what the Jedi think it is. Nowhere does it confirm that Anakin is in fact the Chosen One. As a matter of fact, even if you look at the original trilogy, it kind of implies that he's not. What do I mean by this? Well, in the prequel trilogy, we see Anakin's rise through the ranks as a Jedi, but then he falls to the dark side in Revenge of the Sith, right? He fails. He fails. Flat out. He fails, right? And then, he's not the one that turns himself back to overthrow Palpatine. Luke is. If anything, looking at just those original 6 movies, the conclusion that one should draw is that the prophecy was never about Anakin being the Chosen One. It was about Luke being the Chosen One, right? So, even just looking at those original pre-Disney Star Wars movies, Luke should be the one that you're saying is the Chosen One, and his birth had nothing to do with manipulating the midichlorians and the Force. So this doesn't water down this Chosen One prophecy at all. But then, if we look past that and we actually start to accept the Disney Star Wars movies, which we should, they are part of the canon whether you like it or not, if we look at those, it's shown once again that none of the Skywalkers were the Chosen One, right? Because Palpatine does not die at the end of Return of the Jedi. He comes back, and the person who overthrows him, at this point in time, we don't know if they're going to bring him back for some reason, but the one who defeats him, ultimately, in The Rise of Skywalker is Rey. Now, all 3 of these characters, Luke, Anakin, and Rey, they were all from a desert planet, right? They were all abandoned by their family. Like, all of this stuff applies to all of them. But nowhere had we said anything about it watering down Anakin's story. We heard a little bit about it with Rey because, you know, people like to complain about Rey in general, but nobody complained about Luke watering down Anakin's story. And it's just because that movie came first, right? It was part of the accepted lore. And people just conveniently ignore the fact that Anakin doesn't redeem himself. Luke is the one that pushes him into that redemption, right? People just ignore that. And so then they use this as an opportunity to complain that Anakin's Chosen One prophecy is being watered down by everything that's made up by Disney, right? I reject that hypothesis in general as well. So then let's look at it, even if we want to assume, if you want to assume that Anakin being the Chosen One is the intended trajectory of the series, right? You want to assume that that is untouchable lore, and that's the important part of the entire series, is that Anakin is the Chosen One. The witches creating and carrying twins is not the same as Shmi giving birth to Anakin. Was it manipulation of the Force through midichlorians? Yes. Absolutely. That is something that is canon. It is something that is said to us through like comics and books and stuff. Palpatine did create Anakin. He manipulated midichlorians and brought about Anakin's birth, right? That's something that's in the comics. And that is not the same. Like, that is not the same. I don't, like, how do people not see that that's not the same thing? It's just not. You have witches creating life. I'll also mention again that the Kaminoans created life through cloning. So, I mean, I would equate it closer to that because these are 2 individual girls that they carried and birthed, right? But it's not the same as Anakin being brought up by a single mother as a slave. It's not the same thing. It does not water down the importance of his character. And that's, like, I, I think I've said enough about it. I'm just going to start going in circles here, and it's going to make me mad. So let's move on and talk about why this is important, right? Why do I care, right? Like, obviously, I'm enjoying Acolyte. I find things that are good in Disney Star Wars projects. Why does it matter to me if people are going online and talking about this as if it's the end of the world, saying they're going to disown Disney Star Wars and stop watching, and how they destroyed their childhood, right? Why is this important? It's important because when you hear criticism like this, it drowns out any of the actual criticism that is being used to try and better the projects for the future, right? We hear time and time again all of these complaints from, these major butthurt fanboys about how their series is being ruined by the company that owns it now. We hear it every time something is released. We heard it with Rings of Power in, seeing the women dwarves and black elves. We heard it with pretty much every Disney Star Wars project. And we hear it even now with, DC projects, Marvel projects. We hear it with other TV shows that have really no business being in conversations like this, right? There's no reason for people to be bringing up this stuff. They just solo in and zone in on these things that don't ultimately matter to the overall story being told. They just don't like it because it's not what they wanted, right? And I think with Star Wars, what it really boils down to is we had years of books being written about Star Wars, games fleshing out the universe. And when Disney took over, they decided to make all of that non-canon. They decided to strike it from the canon so that they could tell their own story. And a lot of people got upset by that because they felt like their version of Star Wars was completely erased and that it was destroyed. It wasn't. You can still read those books. You can still love those books, and you can still relate to those stories. If anything, Disney has given you a perfect out, because in Rebels, they show examples of how there can be, branching timelines, alternate universes. This is something Disney is also doing with Marvel. You can basically make anything you want canon to your own experience. So why do you want the story they're currently telling to mirror what you have already read? It does not make sense to me. What is constructive with criticism is if you're going to sit there and actually criticize the actual art in front of you, not what you want it to be, but what has been done and how they achieved it, if they did achieve it. Now, just to prove to you that I am not a Disney Star Wars shill, because that's what I always hear. Anytime I combat these types of arguments, I always have to defend myself, because people like to say, well, if you are okay with this, then you're not a big Star Wars fan. You're just a shill for, Daddy Disney. And that's not the case. I will defend these types of things, but I am very okay with giving criticism. So let's really go into some of the criticisms. And I'm not going to criticize the story of Acolyte as a whole, because the series isn't done yet, and so it would not be fair to talk about the overall theming of the show and if they succeeded in that or not, right? But I'll talk about other Disney Star Wars projects as well, just so you can get a better idea of where I stand here, right? There are certain things that when you criticize it, you can do so with the hope that they will improve in the future. So, for example, I was not a fan in Ahsoka of the way they did the fight choreography. I thought it was slow. It looked like it was staged, which is not what you want in choreography. Like, it obviously is staged, but you don't want it to look that way. It felt slow, it felt sluggish, it was boring, and it seemed more like they were just hitting their marks instead of actually in the moment. Acolyte has improved on this. The fighting in Acolyte is much better. The choreography, even in just the cold open, where there's barely any lightsaber usage, was very good. And it gives me hope that the rest of the series will actually deliver on some of those good lightsaber fight moments that they've been promising. So I was not a fan of that in Ahsoka. Let's go to a negative about Acolyte, because I know people are going to be harping on me for that. You didn't say anything bad about Acolyte. I will right now, okay? Episode 3 was the weakest episode of the season so far. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the lore. It has nothing to do with them supposedly breaking canon, because they don't. It has everything to do with the actual creation of that episode, right? The acting in that episode is atrocious. It is absolutely atrocious, and this is a problem that they have had with pretty much every Star Wars project since Disney took over. The child actors are god-awful. Below the standards that child actors normally are held to, right? Now, I'm not going to pick on these child actors because they're child actors, right? But Disney, as a company with this many resources, should be able to find child actors that can deliver dialogue in a way that does not make me cringe every time they speak. And they did not do that in episode 3 of Acolyte. Even not talking about the kids, a lot of the adult actors in that episode were just so bad. They delivered their lines in such a flat way. It was boring to watch. Nothing was delivered with any type of enthusiasm or energy. Really, the only person in that episode that I actually felt was connecting to the script was Soul. And a lot of people are talking about how great he is in this show, and I do like his characterization. But I'm going to blow your minds right now. That's not all on the actor. A lot of that has to do with the writers and the directors throughout the show giving him that characterization that they are looking for, and then him delivering on that. So it's not as simple as saying, I hate everything except this actor. No, if you like the character of Soul, you have to admit that at least to some extent, you enjoy the writing and the directing on the show. That's just how it is. It's a collaborative effort. It is not one person pulling all of that slack, okay? So, he was the only one in episode 3 that I actually felt believed in what he was doing. Having said that, I'm about to make some people upset. I am very impressed with this actor, okay? He learned English in 4 months just so that he could get the role in Star Wars. But here's the thing about that. He learned English in 4 months. And there are times in the show when you can tell that he learned English in 4 months. Right? Now, is it enough to make me say that I dislike his character? No. But there are times when he delivers lines, too, that I'm like, that wasn't so great. So let's talk about some other negatives from Acolyte, right? Mainly episode 3 again. The pacing of episode 3 was also atrocious, right? The editing was god-awful, and I think that the problem was that we were stuck in this flashback for the entire episode. What they could have done, and what I think they should have done, is they should have taken some of those scenes from the childhood of the main characters, May and Osha, and they should have spliced that in throughout episodes 1 and 2 as well, right? In episode 1, we already knew that we had 2 sisters. We already knew that. And then we already knew that there was some fire. So what if we had taken some of this episode 3, spliced it into episodes 1 and 2, so that we're not stuck with an entire 40-minute episode of these boring children and boring adult characters doing whatever, and then lead up to the reveal in episode 3 that these were witches, right? You see what I'm doing here? I'm talking about stuff that I disliked about it, but I'm doing so in a way that is constructive. I'm saying what worked, and I'm saying what didn't work, and I'm saying what could have worked better. Do you know what's missing from a lot of the conversations we hear whenever people zone in on breaking canon and stuff like that? We don't hear any type of construction, no type of constructive criticism. It's always, this is bad, stop making them. go back to what I liked. Let me clue you in on something. They're not gonna do that. They're gonna keep making stuff, so we might as well try and make it better, right? Because even looking at all of the Disney projects that people have complained about over the years, there's always at least something that people will agree is mostly good in that show, right? In that show and in that movie. There's always at least something that people can latch onto and say, this was a good idea, or this was a good character. So why don't we let them hear that as well? Instead of hearing, I didn't like it, don't do this again. Because now they're going to take that, and either they're not going to listen to you because you're only showing negativity, or they're going to assume that nothing they did worked, and they're going to course correct, and then they're going to leave out the thing that you did like in it. This is the same thing that's happening in that was happening in the Pokemon franchise, right? And a lot of video game franchises, to be honest. But if we look at the Pokemon franchise, in Sword and Shield, a lot of people zoned in on the gosh darn tree that was in the wild area, talked about graphics, talked about the fact that it looked like it was a piece of cardboard, right? So when Scarlet and Violet came out, what did Game Freak really focus on? The textures, the graphics, all of the Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet look fantastic with their models, right? You know what did not improve in Scarlet and Violet, though? Is the performance. That went down. You know what was also showing signs of being problematic in Sword and Shield? The performance. So what I'm saying is, if you're going to zone in on one thing that isn't game breaking or isn't, you know, movie or show breaking, then that's what either they're going to focus on that or they're going to ignore you completely. And if they focus on that, then you're going to lose everything else that you could have had. Now, I'm not saying that Disney is perfect. I'm not saying that any studio is perfect. And I'm not saying that every studio will listen to the fans. But I'm saying that if you want a chance for somebody to listen to your criticisms and to actually take your feedback to heart, you have to do it in good faith. Just by saying stuff like, this breaks canon, this isn't my Star Wars, it kills my childhood, you're basically ensuring that you're never going to get what you want out of this franchise ever again. Instead, focus on stuff that can be constructive. Even if you don't like some of the ways that the stories unfold, there are ways to present that won't be taken as just, you know, immediately ignoring anything from the franchise, right? Because that's what it seems like right now. And you see that with all the conversation. People are saying if you dislike it, it's because you're on the hate train, because you're against the woke Disney, and you're just part of the review bomb, right? There are a lot of people where that's not the case. But because you're aligning yourselves with these types of people that do have that as their agenda, you're not going to be taken seriously. You're not going to be heard. And then it makes it so that people like me, who do want to talk about, you know, the actual art and the actual show and actually try to improve it, people like me, we're not going to be able to talk about it, right? If I talk about criticisms, that's what I hear as well, is that, oh, you're just against it being too woke. That's not the case. I also am not in that camp, right? I'm not in that camp where I'm complaining just because I think it's bad. I want to actively make it better, but I can't do that because nobody is arguing in good faith. And I think that's the main issue with a lot of popular fandoms these days. And honestly, I could ramble about this all day. It makes me so gosh darn mad. Just, it's okay to dislike the way things are going, but at least make it a little